Now that my navigation pattern is in place, I'm ready to add code to create, update, and delete notes. I'll start with creating a note. When the user touches the plus button, they're taken to the editor activity, and they're presented with a screen where they can type a note. They can type any text they like, and it can go for multiple lines. I'll type "here's some text." But right now, when they go back a step, nothing happens. So I need to add code to detect the state that happens when the user touches that plus button, and then add some more code to actually insert something into the database and show it on the list when we come back to the main activity. So I'll go back to my code, and I'll start in my Notes Provider class. I'm going to add a new constant here. The constant will be called the content item type, and it'll be just a simple string. Later on, I'll be using this string to indicate that I'm updating an existing note, but I need to establish the constant now. I'll place it right here after my existing constants. I'll make this one public, because I'll need to refer to it from a number of places in the application. I'll name it content, item, type, and it can be any string. I'll just call it note. Next, I'll open my editor activity class. In this class, I'll declare two private fields. The first will be a string, and I'll call it action. I'll be using this field to remember what I'm doing, whether I'm inserting or updating a note. And then I'll also create a field to represent the edit text object. That's the editor control that the user's typing into. I'll use a type of edit text, and I'll name this one editor. Next, I'll add code in the onCreate method to set the values of those two fields. The editor is easy. That's just a reference to the edit text control in the layout. I'll call findViewById and pass in r.id.editText. And I'll cast the return value as an edit text object. The action is a little bit more complicated. Eventually, when I add code to update an existing node, I'll be passing in a URI as an intent extra. When the user presses the plus button, I won't pass in that URI, so I need to detect that state. I'll get a reference to the current intent object. This is the intent that launched this activity. Then, I'll declare a reference to a URI object. I'll name it URI, all lowercase, and get it from this expression, intent.getParcelableExtra. The URI class implements the parcelable interface. That interface makes it possible to pass a complex object as an intent extra. For the key, I'll pass in that new constant that I just established, notesprovider.contentItemType. If that URI was passed in, it won't be null. But if the user pressed the insert button, it will be null. So I'll use conditional code, an if statement, and my condition will be if URI is null. And if it is, then I know that I'm supposed to be inserting a new note. I'll save that information in the action field that I just declared up at the top of the class. And I'll set it to a value of a constant of the intent class, intent.actionInsert. And while I'm working with this condition, that is, knowing that I'm inserting a new note, I'll change the title at the top of the activity. By default, it says Edit Note, but I'm going to change it to New Note. And to do that, I'll call the setTitle method of the activity class and pass in a string of new note. After I type in the string, I'll extract it as a string resource, and I'll set the resource name or ID as new_note. So let's test that much code. I'll run the app in the emulator, and when the app appears, I'll press the plus button, and I see the string new note appear at the top of the activity. So I know I'm evaluating my condition correctly. I'm still not going to be saving anything. That takes a little bit more code. I'll go back to my editor activity class. I'm going to add a new method down at the bottom of the class. It'll be private, and it'll return void, and it'll be named Finish Editing. This method will be called when the user presses the device's back button or the up or back button on the toolbar. My first step will be to find out what the user typed in. I'll create a string variable that I'll call new text. And I'll get its value from my editor object. That's the edit text object that I already set the reference to. And I'll call its method getText.toString. And then from there, I'll call the trim method. And that'll make sure that I eliminate any leading or following white space. Next, I'll evaluate my current action. The action will be one of two values. First, I'll add code for action insert. I'll use a switch statement for this, and I'll evaluate the action field. I'll enter a case of intent.actionInsert. If I'm supposed to be inserting a new note, I first want to make sure that I'm not inserting a blank note. So I'll use some conditional code, and I'll look at a condition of newText.length equals 0. If the note is blank, I'll call the method setResult and pass in a value of result_canceled. That's a constant, and it's basically a message I'm sending back to the main activity that says I've canceled whatever operation was requested. But then I'll add an else clause, and here I'll call a method that I haven't created yet that I'll name insertNote. And then finally, after the switch statement, I'll call the finish method, and that means I'm finished with this activity, go back to the parent activity, which is the main activity. Now I'll implement the insertNote method. I'll go to the call to the method and use a quick fix and create the method. Most of the code that I need to enter here is a duplicate of what I've already done in the main activity class. So I'll go to the main activity class, and I'll use the structure view, and I'll find my insertNote method. And I'll select these 3 lines of code, starting with creating the content values object and ending with calling the insert method from the content resolver. I'll copy that code, and then go back to my editor activity, and I'll paste the code into place. And when prompted, I'll import the content values class. Now, when I put a value into the values object, I'm getting an error because I don't have a variable named noteText, as I did in the main activity. So I'm going to change the signature of the insertNote method. In the call to the method, I'll pass in the value of newText. And then I'll use a quick fix to reconcile the differences in the signatures between the call to the method and the method definition. And I'll say I want to add a string as the first parameter to that method. And then I'll change the name of the argument that's being passed in to noteText. And now everything is working correctly. Next, I'll delete this little bit of code. The insert method will be returning a URI, but I don't care about it. I'm going to ignore it. So now I've created the values object, I've put the text into it, and I've inserted the data into the database table. And then I'll once again call the setResult method, but this time I'll set the value as result OK. And that means I completed the operation that was requested. So now I have a finish editing method, which is calling the insertNote method. And I need to call the finish editing method from 2 different places. First, I'll add an override of the onBackPressed method. This method is called when the user touches the back button on the device. And within that method, I'll call finish editing. The other condition when I want to call my finish editing method is when the user touches the up button or the back button on the toolbar. That's registered in the onOptionsItemSelected method. I'm going to get rid of all these comments. And I'll also get rid of these lines of code. I won't need those. And I'll add a switch statement, and I'll examine the value of item.getItemID. When the user touches that back button, the ID is always the same. I'll put a case statement in and look for android.r.id.home. And then once again, I'll call the finish editing method and make sure I include my break statement. And I'll also change the return statement here to true. That means I've always handled the menu selection. So now my code is complete in the editor activity. I have just a little bit more code to add. And this will go in the main activity class. When the user completes the operation in the editor activity, they'll press the back button or the up button to return to the main activity. And that'll trigger the method onActivityResult. I'll add an override of that method. I'll delete the code that's calling the superclasses version of the method, and then I'll add an if statement. And here's my condition. First, I'll make sure I'm getting the right request code, the request code I set when I launched the editor activity. And that's the constant editor request code. And then I'll also examine the result code that's passed in as the second argument. And I'll say if result code has a value of result OK. And if both of those are true, then I'll call my method restartLoader. And that method restarts the loader from the loader manager and refills the data from the database and displays it in the list. All the code is done, and I'm ready to test. When the app launches, I'll click the plus button to go to the editor activity, and I'll type, "This is a new note." Then I'll click the back button, and there's my new data. I'll try it again, and I'll type another note, and this time I'll click the back button on the device, and that works too. And then finally, I'll click the plus button, but this time I won't type anything in, and when I go back to the main activity, nothing happens. And that's exactly what I want. I don't want to create notes with empty strings. So now my app is adding new data. The next two steps will be to update existing data and delete notes.